Dad opened the door. On a freezing Christmas night, I stood trembling on my father's porch, clutching my soaking wet 1-year-old daughter. "He brought his mistress home," I whispered. His mother packed up our things, threw the two of us out, and locked the door. My father looked at his little granddaughter shivering from the cold. Then he tightened his grip on the ring of keys in his hand. They picked the wrong family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive the ultimate betrayal from the people who were supposed to love you. My name is Chloe. I am 33 years old, and until that freezing Christmas Eve, I genuinely believed I was building a solid, loving life with my husband Jamal. The sleet was coming down in relentless freezing sheets, slicing through the thin fabric of my holiday sweater as I stood on the icy front porch of the home I had poured my heart and soul into. The festive holiday lights I had meticulously strung up just 2 weeks ago flickered mockingly overhead, casting harsh, moving shadows across Jamal's face. He stood squarely in the doorway, blocking the warmth of our living room, his arm wrapped tightly around a woman I did not recognize. She was wearing my favorite silk robe, the one Jamal had bought for my birthday, sipping hot cocoa from my favorite mug. "This is Tiffany Jamal," announced his voice entirely devoid of warmth, hesitation, or remorse. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple right in front of my face. "She is my destiny, Chloe. We are meant to be together, and I am not hiding her anymore. I am done living a lie." Before my frozen brain could even process the absolute absurdity of his words, a heavy black trash bag sailed past his legs and landed with a sickening thud in the snow at my feet. My mother-in-law Beatrice stepped into the doorframe, wiping her hands together as if she had just taken out the actual garbage. Beatrice had always looked down her nose at me. From the day Jamal and I got married 5 years ago, she made it her personal mission to remind everyone that I came from a hard-working blue-collar neighborhood, while her precious son was destined for the corporate stratosphere. "You should be thanking us for ripping the Band-Aid off," Beatrice sneered, adjusting her expensive, perfectly tailored cashmere cardigan. "We let you play house and pretend you belonged here for 5 years. But Jamal is a senior executive now. He is moving up in the world. He needs a wife with real pedigree, someone who naturally understands his elevated circles. Not some basic bookkeeper who constantly drags down his image at important corporate dinners. Grab your cheap clothes and get off my son's property before I call the police and tell them you are trespassing." I clutched my 1-year-old daughter Zuri tighter to my chest, trying desperately to shield her tiny body from the biting, relentless wind. A basic bookkeeper. That was the carefully constructed lie I had allowed them all to believe. For half a decade I had played the quiet, unassuming, supportive wife, deliberately downplaying my own massive career to coddle Jamal's incredibly fragile ego. When he panicked over his high-stakes promotions, I was the one who quietly reviewed his complex financial models late at night. I fixed his disastrous mathematical errors before his boss ever saw them all, while pretending I was just organizing simple spreadsheets for a local firm. I made myself small so he could feel tall. I dimmed my own light so he could shine. And this brutal, humiliating exile was my reward. "Jamal," I said, my voice trembling violently from the freezing rain, not from fear. "Your daughter is freezing. You cannot do this on Christmas Eve. You cannot just throw your own child out into a winter storm." Jamal actually laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that cut through the howling wind and shattered whatever remaining love I held for him. "Zuri is fine. The cold builds character. Besides, you are the one who decided to leave your parents' house early and ruin the holiday surprise. We were going to handle this tomorrow. And do not bother fighting this, Chloe. My brother-in-law Connor already took care of everything." At the smug mention of Connor, my stomach tightened into a hard knot. Connor was a slick, white corporate attorney who had married Jamal's sister, Keisha. He had always treated my family with a blend of veiled racism and overt condescending arrogance, acting as the legal attack dog for Beatrice's every whim. "Connor drafted the papers yesterday," Jamal stated, a victorious smirk playing on his lips. "You are leaving with absolutely nothing. No house, no savings, no alimony. You are going back to the hood exactly as you came, penniless and irrelevant." Tiffany offered a sickly sweet theatrical pout, leaning her head against Jamal's shoulder. Do not worry, Chloe. Zuri is going to love having a new upgraded mommy. We already bought her so many beautiful expensive toys. With a final look of absolute disgust, Beatrice reached forward and slammed the heavy oak door right in my face. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly, locking me and my crying baby out in the merciless winter storm. I did not break down. I did not pound my fists on the wood or scream into the night like they probably hoped I would. Crying would not keep my daughter warm. Operating purely on maternal instinct and rising adrenaline, I scooped up the trash bag, wrapped my heavy wool coat tightly around Zuri's shivering body, and trudged through the accumulating snow to my car. The heater struggled to fight off the freezing temperatures as I gripped the steering wheel, navigating the treacherous icy roads. The 20-minute drive to my parents' house felt like an agonizing eternity. Every slide of the tires, every gust of wind pushing against the frame of the car, every soft whimper from the back seat fueled a quiet, steady fire growing inside my chest. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a submissive, uneducated little woman who would just disappear into the shadows and cry. They had no idea who they had just declared war on. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, a modest, meticulously well-kept brick house that Beatrice had always openly despised and mocked for being too ordinary. I ran up the front steps, shielding Zuri from the sleet, and banged heavily on the door. My father Calvin pulled it open almost immediately. Calvin was a stoic, deeply observant man, a retired property law attorney who had spent his entire life quietly building an incredibly lucrative real estate empire. It was an empire that nobody in Jamal's pretentious status, obsessed family had ever bothered to research simply because Calvin preferred driving a 10-year-old truck over a flashy sports car. Dad opened the door, I pleaded, my teeth chattering uncontrollably as the wind whipped around us. He stepped back instantly, ushering us into the overwhelming, comforting warmth of the hallway. When he saw my soaking wet clothes, my blue lips and Zuri shivering against my shoulder, the calm, gentle demeanor he usually carried vanished entirely. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. His jaw clenched tight, a muscle feathering dangerously in his cheek as his sharp eyes took in the garbage bag dragging along the hardwood floor. He brought his mistress home, I whispered, handing Zuri over to my mother. Vivian, who had rushed into the foyer with warm, dry blankets, her face dropping in horror. His mother packed up our things, threw the two of us out, and locked the door. Jamal says Connor drafted legal papers, so I leave with absolutely nothing. Calvin did not yell. He did not curse or throw things. He simply walked over to the entryway table, picked up his heavy ring of keys, and gripped them so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He looked at his little granddaughter, safe now in Vivian's arms, her small cries quieting down. Then he looked at me, his eyes as hard and unforgiving as flint. They picked the wrong family. Before I could even formulate a response to the quiet, terrifying promise in his voice, my phone vibrated violently in my damp coat pocket. I pulled it out, wiping the melted snow from the cracked screen. It was an automated, high-priority banking alert from our joint financial institution. Jamal had not just kicked me out into the cold. The notification showed he had just completely drained our entire joint savings account, transferring $45,000 to an unknown offshore routing number. A second alert followed immediately after the first. All my secondary credit cards had been unilaterally canceled by the primary account holder. I stared at the bright screen in the dim hallway, the glowing red text confirming that my visible balance was now at absolute zero. The financial ambush was complete. The morning light filtering through the frost-covered windows of my childhood bedroom offered no warmth on Christmas Day. I sat at the edge of the mattress, watching the steady, peaceful rise and fall of Zuri's chest as she slept wrapped in my mother's quilted blankets. She was safe. That was the only thing keeping the cold terror at bay. The digital clock on the nightstand read 7 in the morning when my phone vibrated against the dark wood, shattering the quiet. I picked it up, half expecting a hollow apology from Jamal. Instead, the screen illuminated with a long, meticulously typed message from Connor. Connor was not just Jamal's brother-in-law. He was a partner at a prestigious downtown law firm who wore his privilege like a weapon. The text was a masterclass in legal intimidation disguised as family concern. He informed me that by leaving the marital residence with our daughter during a winter storm, I had established a clear pattern of unstable behavior and child endangerment. He formally stated that because I had no independent financial means and had effectively abandoned the property, he was filing an emergency ex parte motion for full sole custody of Zuri first thing Monday morning. My breath caught in my throat, but the text was not finished. Connor could never resist twisting the knife. "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Chloe," the message concluded. "Jamal is willing to be generous, but you need to play ball. We both know your retired blue-collar clerk of a father cannot fund a legal war against my firm, save Calvin his pension, and surrender quietly." I stared at the glowing screen. A retired blue-collar clerk. That was how they viewed Calvin. That was how they viewed all of us. They saw my father's faded flannel shirts and 10-year-old pickup truck and assumed weakness, completely blind to the millions he held in commercial real estate. They looked at my quiet demeanor and assumed I was a helpless victim waiting to be crushed. Just as I finished reading, the phone rang in my hand. The caller ID flashed Jamal's smiling contact photo. I swiped to answer, pressing the speaker button, letting the silence stretch between us. "Merry Christmas, Chloe," Jamal said. His voice was smooth, coated in that arrogant corporate charm he used when closing a hostile deal. "I hope you and your parents are enjoying the holiday in their little basement." In the background, I could hear the unmistakable clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the sharp grating sound of Beatrice laughing. "I am calling to offer you a way out," Jamal continued, his tone dripping with fake magnanimity. "Connor has the custody papers ready to file, but I do not want to destroy you in court. Tiffany thinks we should show some holiday spirit. So here's the deal. You sign a quitclaim deed surrendering all rights to the house. You agree to supervised weekend visitation with Zuri so my daughter can be raised in a proper high-class environment. In exchange, I will cut you a certified check for $5,000. A little start over fund. It is more than generous considering you contributed nothing to my success." Beatrice's voice pierced through the speaker, loud and vindictive. "Take the money, you ungrateful girl. Tiffany has already ordered new custom drapes for the living room. We are erasing your tacky taste by New Year's Eve." I listened to the sound of Jamal breathing, waiting for my tears, waiting for my desperate, sobbing surrender. He was expecting the basic bookkeeper to break. He was expecting the terrified mother to beg for mercy. I reached down and pressed the red button, ending the call without saying a single word. Silence was not weakness. Silence was the sound of a predator acquiring its target. I left Zuri sleeping peacefully and walked quietly down the hall to the kitchen. Calvin was already awake, sitting at the head of the oak table with a steaming mug of black coffee. He did not ask what the phone call was about. He simply slid a fresh cup of coffee across the table toward me and went back to reading his morning paper. He knew I did not need comforting. I needed space to work. I retrieved my laptop from my overnight bag. To the outside world, it looked like a standard mid-range machine used for balancing small business ledgers. I pressed the power button, bypassing the standard login screen with a sequence of keystrokes that booted up a heavily encrypted custom-built operating system. Jamal and his family thought they had married a basic bookkeeper. They had spent 5 years mocking my simple job and quiet lifestyle. They had no idea that my quiet lifestyle was a deliberate choice, a necessary cover for my actual profession. I was a highly sought-after forensic accountant. I specialized in dismantling complex corporate fraud, tracking hidden offshore assets, and ruining white-collar criminals. Operating through a discreet, anonymous corporate entity, my client list included federal regulators and international banks. I did not just look at spreadsheets, I destroyed empires. I opened my secure financial portal and logged into my private investment portfolio. The screen populated with a balance that spanned 8 figures, a vast, diversified accumulation of wealth, built on finding the money that arrogant men tried to hide. Jamal draining our joint account of $45,000 was not a financial death blow to me. It was stealing spare change from a vault. With a few rapid keystrokes, I liquidated a massive sum of cash, transferring it into a fresh, untraceable account, completely insulated from any marital discovery. I then opened my secure email client and drafted a message to Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was not just a family law attorney, she was a legal executioner. She was the most feared, ruthless litigator in the state, a woman who ate arrogant corporate partners like Connor for breakfast. I attached a brief summary of the impending emergency custody filing, uploaded my financial verification, and immediately wired a $100,000 retainer directly to her firm. The confirmation pinged back within 2 minutes. Eleanor was on the case. Connor's Monday morning ambush was going to hit a titanium wall. With my daughter's safety secured, I turned my attention back to my husband. Jamal thought he was a genius for emptying our savings on Christmas Eve. He assumed I would be too panicked to notice the details of his theft. But forensic accounting is not about panic. It is about following the digital footprints that criminals always leave behind. I pulled the raw transaction data from the banking alert I had received the night before. I isolated the offshore routing number Jamal had used to hide our money and fed it into my proprietary tracing software. The program began parsing through thousands of global financial registries, cross-referencing shell companies, dummy directors, and hidden corporate structures. I watched the progress bar inch forward, my coffee growing cold, forgotten beside me. I expected to find a simple hidden domestic account, maybe a cheap offshore setup he and Connor had cobbled together to hide his annual bonuses. The software chimed a sharp, crisp sound that signaled a direct high-level match. The screen flooded with cascading data points, lighting up my face with the glow of absolute ruin. I began pulling the associated ledgers, retrieving archived records from my deep storage servers. There is a file you can reference named A_7. I accessed it immediately, watching the data streams align perfectly with Jamal's routing number. The system pulled up secondary layers of the corporate shell requiring cross-verification. There is a file you can reference named B_7. I decrypted it, mapping the exact flow of illicit cash. The web grew wider, far more complex than a simple marital theft. I dug deeper into the offshore holding structures. There is a file you can reference named C_7. I opened it, linking the dummy directors directly to Connor's law firm. Finally, I pulled the master transaction log. There is a file you can reference named D_7. I executed the final query and sat back in my chair as the truth materialized on my screen, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. The numbers staring back at me were staggering. Jamal had not just opened a secret account to hide our $45,000. The routing number belonged to an active, massive shell company. And that shell company was currently siphoning millions of dollars directly from Jamal's corporate employer. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The digital trail was undeniable. Jamal and Connor had built an elaborate embezzlement pipeline, stealing corporate funds and washing them through offshore accounts. They had grown so arrogant, so utterly convinced of their own untouchable brilliance, that Jamal had carelessly used that exact same pipeline to hide our joint savings, assuming I would never have the technical capability to trace it. He had practically handed me the murder weapon with his fingerprints perfectly preserved on the handle. My husband wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. He wanted to take my daughter, mock my father, and force me onto the street so he could play high society with his mistress. He thought he was dealing with a frightened, helpless victim. I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet kitchen. I looked up to see Calvin watching me from across the table, his eyes bright with unspoken understanding. They wanted a war, but they had absolutely no idea that I already owned the battlefield, and I was about to burn their entire lives to the ground. The crisp winter air of Monday morning bit at my cheeks as I walked up the sweeping granite steps of the county courthouse. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask. I was no longer the shivering, terrified woman they had cast out into the freezing sleet just days prior. I had spent the weekend armed with financial data and ruthless legal counsel. Today the hunted was becoming the hunter. As I stepped through the heavy glass doors into the echoing marble lobby, a loud, obnoxious burst of laughter immediately drew my attention. They were standing near the center elevators, making an absolute spectacle of themselves. Connor stood tall and smug in a bespoke navy suit, holding court like a king among peasants. Beatrice was practically vibrating with malicious glee, her expensive fur coat draped over one arm. Jamal stood beside them looking arrogant and entirely unbothered by the fact that he was attempting to steal his daughter from her mother. And clinging to Jamal's arm was Tiffany. Tiffany had gone out of her way to look the part of the devoted new matriarch. She carried a ridiculously expensive designer diaper bag slung over her shoulder. Her hair pulled back into a demure style that completely contradicted the woman who had smirked at me from my own front porch. Beatrice spotted me first. Her eyes raked over my tailored suit and her lips curled into a vicious sneer. "Look who decided to show up!" Beatrice announced, her voice carrying loudly across the cavernous lobby. "I am surprised you could afford the bus fare down here, Chloe. Did your father have to dip into his little retirement jar to buy you a new outfit for the occasion?" Connor chuckled, adjusting his silk tie. "Let her have her moment, Beatrice. It is the last time she's going to see the inside of a courtroom without a public defender." Tiffany leaned closer to Jamal, pitching her voice just loud enough for me to hear. "Do not worry about Zuri, Chloe. I have already set up a beautiful nursery at the house. She is going to love her new mommy. We bought her the absolute best of everything, things you could never provide." I kept my face perfectly still. I did not blink. I did not engage. Eleanor Vance. My attorney had explicitly instructed me to let them dig their own graves. Eleanor stood quietly beside me, observing the performance with the detached clinical interest of a scientist watching bacteria under a microscope. She simply checked her gold watch and gestured toward the courtroom doors. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for crushing frivolous litigation, took the bench. She looked over her reading glasses at the opposing tables. Connor immediately launched into his aggressive theatrical opening statement. He paced in front of the judge, his voice dripping with synthetic concern as he painted a horrifying, completely fabricated picture of my life. "Your Honor, we are here today on an emergency basis to protect a vulnerable 1-year-old child," Connor declared, pressing his hand to his chest. My client, a successful and highly respected corporate executive, was forced to rescue his daughter from a deeply unstable environment. The child's mother abandoned the marital residence and has proven herself fundamentally unfit to provide even the most basic standard of living. Connor then pivoted, weaponizing my family background just as Beatrice had done for the last 5 years. He aggressively painted my history as impoverished and uncultured. He described the working-class neighborhood where I grew up as a blighted, dangerous area. He spoke of my father Calvin with dripping condescension, referring to him as a simple retired blue-collar clerk who lacked the financial literacy or physical space to harbor a toddler. He told the judge that Jamal had rescued me from a life of poverty and that by reverting to my roots, I was actively endangering Zuri's welfare. For 5 years, Jamal and his family had treated my background as a dirty secret, a source of endless shame they had to cover up at corporate dinners. Now Connor was using those same classist prejudices to legally sever me from my child. "To compound this tragedy, Your Honor," Connor continued, his voice rising in dramatic crescendo, "the mother has absolutely zero financial means. Our records indicate her bank accounts are completely empty. She is entirely destitute. She is currently residing in the damp, unfinished basement of her parents' cramped house. We have filed a motion requesting immediate full sole custody for my client. We ask that the mother be restricted to supervised alternating weekend visitation until she can prove she has a safe, mold-free environment and the financial capacity to feed her own child." Jamal sat at the petitioner table looking incredibly pleased with himself. He actually offered me a sympathetic, patronizing nod across the aisle, as if he were a benevolent ruler taking pity on a starving beggar. Judge Harrison frowned, looking down at Connor's emergency motion. She turned her sharp gaze toward our table. "Counselor," the judge said, addressing Eleanor, These are severe allegations, a damp basement, zero financial means. How does your client respond to this emergency custody petition? Eleanor Vance stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her impeccably tailored blazer and walked toward the bench. She did not raise her voice. She did not pace. She projected an aura of absolute lethal authority. Your Honor. Eleanor began, her voice ringing clear and steady in the silent courtroom. Opposing counsel has woven a very compelling work of fiction this morning. It is truly a shame that absolutely none of it is grounded in reality. My client does not live in a damp basement. She does not lack financial means. In fact, the only emergency here today is opposing counsel's blatant disregard for the truth and his attempt to weaponize the court system to facilitate his client's adultery. Connor sputtered, his face turning red. Objection! This is completely irrelevant and slanderous. Eleanor ignored him entirely. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy document featuring a bright blue municipal stamp. She handed it directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. If you turn to page 3, Your Honor, Eleanor continued calmly, you will find a freshly recorded property deed finalized and stamped by the city registry at 8 o'clock this morning. Over the holiday weekend, my client purchased a new primary residence for herself and her daughter. She is not residing in her father's home. She is the sole owner of a luxury residential penthouse located in the financial district. The purchase price was $3 million. A collective suffocating gasp echoed from Jamal's side of the courtroom. Beatrice let out a strangled noise. Jamal completely lost his smug posture, his jaw dropping open as he stared at me in absolute shock. Furthermore, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a surgical scalpel, the property was purchased entirely in cash. I have provided the corresponding bank statements proving my client holds liquid assets well into the 8 figures. The assertion that she is destitute is a profound, easily disproven lie. Judge Harrison scrutinized the deed, her eyes scanning the prominent blue stamp and the undeniable financial records attached to it. The judge's expression shifted from judicial neutrality to cold, hard disgust. She looked up and locked her gaze on Connor, who had gone completely pale, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Counselor Judge Harrison snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. You have dragged this court into an emergency session based on the premise that this child is living in a moldy basement with a destitute mother. Yet I am holding a cash deed for a $3 million penthouse. Do you make it a habit of filing fraudulent emergency motions without verifying a single fact about the opposing party? Connor visibly swallowed hard, gripping the edge of his table. Your Honor, we were operating on the best information available at the time. My client believed his wife had no assets. Your client was mistaken, the judge interrupted harshly, and you have wasted this court's time. This emergency motion for sole custody is denied in its entirety. Custody will remain joint with primary physical residence with the mother pending a full evidentiary hearing. I suggest you get your facts straight before you step into my courtroom again, counsel. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. It was over in less than 20 minutes. The grand, terrifying ambush they had planned all weekend had been completely dismantled, crushed under the weight of undeniable absolute wealth. I stood up, buttoning my blazer, and gathered my purse. Jamal sat frozen in his chair, staring at the polished wood table as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Beatrice was frantically whispering to Tiffany, whose eyes were darting around the room in sheer panic. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. I was halfway down the corridor heading toward the elevators when heavy, furious footsteps echoed behind me. Connor cut in front of me, blocking my path to the elevators. His previously immaculate hair was slightly disheveled, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His ego had just been publicly humiliated by a judge, and he was desperate to regain control of the narrative. You think you are so incredibly smart, Chloe? Connor sneered, leaning in close, trying to use his height to intimidate me. You think flashing some hidden cash makes you untouchable. I do not know whose money you stole or what kind of fraud your father committed to get that cash, but it changes absolutely nothing. I looked at him calmly, refusing to take a single step back. Jamal is finalizing the sale of your marital home tomorrow morning. Connor gloated, his voice dripping with malice. He is cashing out the equity and cutting you out completely, so enjoy your little paper victory today. By tomorrow afternoon, Jamal is going to have liquid capital, and you are going to be legally homeless on paper when we invalidate whatever shady shell game you used to buy that penthouse. You are going to lose Chloe. We are going to bleed you dry until you have nothing left. I listened to his desperate, pathetic threats. I looked at his expensive suit paid for by the prestige of his downtown law firm. A law firm that prided itself on its exclusive address in the heart of the financial district. An address that I knew intimately. I smiled at him. It was a slow, genuinely bright smile that made Connor falter, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Connor had absolutely no idea. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he had not bothered to read the full address on the deed Eleanor had submitted to the judge. If he had, he would have realized that the luxury penthouse I had just purchased in cash encompassed the entire top floor of the exact commercial high-rise where his prestigious law firm leased their office space. By purchasing the master residential top floor, I had absorbed the commercial lease rights for the floors below it. I was not just a basic bookkeeper anymore. I was not a helpless victim. And I was certainly not intimidated by his empty threats. I am his landlord. Tuesday morning brought a crisp, clear winter sky, the kind that made the city skyline gleam like polished silver. I sat at the expansive marble kitchen island in my new penthouse, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching a live high-definition security feed on my encrypted monitor. I had requested full access to the building systems the moment the deed transfer cleared. I wanted a front-row seat to the exact moment Connor's manufactured reality shattered. His entire identity, his partnership track, his insufferable arrogance, it was all inextricably tied to the prestige of this specific downtown address. The senior partners at his firm valued optics above all else, and Connor had leveraged his marriage to Jamal's sister to project an image of unshakable wealth and stability. Losing this office space would not just be an inconvenience, it would be a fatal blow to his career. On the screen, the feed showed the 34th floor. The elevator doors parted, and Connor stepped out, clutching his Italian leather briefcase, practically strutting toward the double glass doors of his firm. He looked completely self-assured, oblivious to the storm about to hit him. Then he stopped dead in his tracks. Taped directly at eye level, right over the frosted gold lettering of the firm's name, was a bright yellow, legally binding notice of eviction and breach of lease. The building manager, whom I had generously retained with a substantial bonus that morning, had executed my orders perfectly. I watched Connor rip the paper from the glass. Even on the silent feed, I could see his face cycle through confusion, utter disbelief, and then a purple, unhinged rage. He whipped his head around looking for someone to scream at, just as two senior partners stepped off the adjacent elevator and paused, staring directly at the glaring yellow notice crumpled in his fist. My phone began to vibrate violently on the marble counter less than 3 minutes later. The caller ID flashed Connor's name. I let it ring 4 times, taking a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute frantic desperation radiating through the digital signal. When I finally answered, I did not say hello. I simply listened to the sound of him hyperventilating on the other end of the line. "You vindictive, psychotic witch!" Connor screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of my kitchen. "You think a fake piece of paper is going to scare me? You think you can forge an eviction notice and slap it on my firm? I am going to have you arrested for harassment. I will have Eleanor Vance disbarred. I will personally drag this divorce out for the next 3 decades until you are drowning in so much legal debt you will have to sell your organs to feed your daughter." He was unraveling the polished corporate shark replaced by a cornered, terrified rat. "I will make sure the judge grants Jamal full custody based on this unhinged behavior." He continued to rant, his breath hitching. "You are going to lose your kid. You are going to lose every single penny you managed to hide, and I am going to make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life paying for this stunt." Withdraw this notice immediately, or I swear to God I will bankrupt you by Friday. I waited until he paused to take a breath. My voice when I spoke was completely flat, devoid of any emotion that he could latch onto. It was the voice of a forensic auditor delivering a fatal discrepancy report. Section 4, Paragraph 2, Clause B of your commercial lease agreement. I recited smoothly, never taking my eyes off the security feed, where he was now pacing frantically in a stairwell. The tenant shall not engage in any activity on the premises that violates federal or state financial regulations, nor shall the tenant utilize the premises to operate undeclared corporate entities. Furthermore, the morality clause clearly stipulates that the primary leaseholder retains the absolute right to terminate the agreement with 30 days' notice if the tenant brings disrepute to the building or engages in documented financial crimes. Connor went completely silent. The only sound was his rapid, shallow breathing. You ran the incorporation papers for Jamal's shell company out of Suite 3400. I continued my words, striking like surgical incisions. You used the firm's secure servers to initiate wire transfers of embezzled corporate funds. You violated the commercial code, you breached the morality clause, and you turned my building into the headquarters for a federal crime. I own the concrete beneath your feet, Connor. I am the sole proprietor. I am not withdrawing the notice. You have 29 days to pack your boxes before I have security. Throw your custom mahogany desk out onto the pavement. He hung up the phone. He did not say another word. He just terminated the connection, completely paralyzed by the realization that I held every single card. I watched on the feed as he slumped against the concrete wall of the stairwell, running his hands over his face, his precious corporate armor completely stripped away. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. But cornered rats are dangerous. They scramble for survival. By noon, I saw the ripple effects of his panic. Eleanor called me with an urgent update. Connor had just filed a request to expedite the sale of Jamal in my marital home. Jamal was desperate for liquid cash. His bank accounts were empty, his credit cards were canceled, and now his co-conspirator was facing professional annihilation. They needed money to fund their legal defense and to maintain the lavish lifestyle Jamal had promised his new mistress. Connor was trying to push the closing date up to tomorrow morning, waiving all standard inspection periods and demanding an immediate wire transfer of the equity to Jamal's private account. Let them expedite it, I told Eleanor, staring at my dual monitor setup. Do not block the sale. Just make sure the escrow company routes the closing documents through my secure server for standard marital asset verification. Eleanor agreed, recognizing that I was setting another trap. Within an hour, the digital paperwork for the expedited sale hit my inbox. Jamal was selling our 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs for significantly under market value, a classic move for someone desperate to liquidate an asset and run. The buyer was listed as a private investment firm called Sunrise Equity Holdings, a private investment firm buying a suburban house under market value with no inspections. It was sloppy. It was incredibly aggressively sloppy. I cracked my knuckles and launched my tracing software, pulling the incorporation data for Sunrise Equity Holdings. The firm had been registered just 3 weeks ago. There was no trading history, no physical address other than a registered agent in Delaware and a suspiciously thin corporate veil. I started pulling the thread. I ran the registered agent's details through my cross-reference databases, searching for secondary connections. The software chewed through tax records, utility bills, and public filings. It bypassed the dummy names and hit a solid, undeniable financial link. The funding for Sunrise Equity Holdings was entirely composed of high-interest unsecured personal loans. The guarantor on those loans was a familiar name: Tiffany. Jamal's beautiful high-class destiny was not a wealthy socialite. She was a complete fraud. I sat forward, my eyes scanning the horrifying reality of Tiffany's financial footprint. She was completely drowning in debt. She had maxed out credit cards, defaulted on multiple luxury car leases, and had 2 prior evictions on her record. Tiffany was a grifter who had targeted Jamal, believing his lies about being a wealthy corporate titan. Now she was using a shell company funded by predatory loans to buy our marital house for pennies, likely planning to flip it or leverage the equity to bail herself out of her own massive financial hole. Jamal thought he was securing cash to save himself. He had absolutely no idea that his precious new mistress was about to steal the last remaining asset he had left. I smiled, taking another sip of my coffee. I was not going to stop the sale. I was going to let Jamal walk right into the slaughterhouse. The heavy oak doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club swung open, revealing a world meticulously designed to separate the elite from everyone else. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over the grand foyer, illuminating the polished marble floors and the towering floral arrangements of imported white orchids. For 5 years, I had walked through these doors 2 steps behind Jamal, keeping my head down, while Beatrice introduced me to her friends as her son's little charity case. She had weaponized this club against my family, using the strict dress codes, the exorbitant initiation fees, and the unspoken social rules to constantly remind my mother and me that we lacked the pedigree to truly belong. Today I was not walking behind anyone. I stepped into the dining room alongside my mother, Vivian. We were both dressed in impeccable, understated luxury. Vivian wore a tailored cream pantsuit that radiated quiet power, her posture completely straight, her eyes taking in the room with absolute confidence. We bypassed the hostess stand, entirely strolling past the intricate ice sculptures and the sprawling champagne bar. The Sunday brunch was in full swing, the room packed with the city's most affluent wives and socialites. At the absolute center of the room, occupying the largest and most visible table, sat Beatrice. She was in her element, wearing an ostentatious emerald green dress and dripping in diamonds. She was holding court with 6 other wealthy matriarchs. Sitting directly to her right, wearing a sickeningly sweet smile and my favorite pearl earrings, was Tiffany. Beatrice was practically glowing as she presented Tiffany to her high society circle, loudly praising her supposed refined tastes and elevating her as the upgrade their family had desperately needed. Vivian and I did not hide in the corners. We walked directly to the reserved table right next to Beatrice's, a prime spot overlooking the manicured 18th hole of the golf course, and sat down. It took exactly 30 seconds for Beatrice to notice us. The loud, ringing laughter at her table died instantly. Beatrice paused mid-sentence, her champagne flute frozen in the air. Her eyes darted from me to my mother, her face flushing a deep, angry red. Tiffany let out a theatrical, trembling gasp, clutching her chest, as if we had walked in carrying weapons. "What on earth do you think you are doing here?" Beatrice hissed, pushing her chair back and marching over to our table. Her voice was meant to be a harsh whisper, but her rage made it carry across the quiet dining room. "You do not belong here, Chloe. And bringing your mother to gawk at my family is a new level of pathetic." I unfolded my linen napkin and placed it on my lap. "We are here for brunch, Beatrice. The crab cakes are highly recommended." Tiffany immediately seized the opportunity to play the victim. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself, her eyes shining with perfectly manufactured crocodile tears. She looked around at the other wealthy patrons, making sure she had an audience. "Please, Chloe." Tiffany pleaded, her voice trembling with fake terror. "I know you are unstable right now, but stalking us to our private club is terrifying. We just want to move on peacefully. Please stop harassing our family." The surrounding tables fell completely silent. The wealthy patrons were watching us with morbid fascination, whispering behind their mimosas. Beatrice stood taller, emboldened by Tiffany's performance and the attention of her peers. "You are deeply disturbed, Chloe," Beatrice announced loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear her. "Jamal was right to throw you out. I knew you were unhinged, but tracking us down at an exclusive members-only club is absolute lunacy. You are trespassing. Get up and leave this instant before I have you thrown out like the trash you are." Vivian calmly picked up her silver fork. "We are not leaving, Beatrice. We have every legal right to be sitting at this table." Beatrice let out a harsh, barking laugh. "A legal right. Do you hear yourself, Vivian? You are a public school teacher, married to a retired clerk. You could not afford the valet parking at this establishment, let alone a dining tab. I tolerated you in this building when your daughter was married to my son. But that charity has expired." Beatrice whipped her head around, snapping her fingers wildly at a passing waiter. "Get the club manager immediately. Bring security. I want these trespassers removed from the premises right now." The waiter scurried away, panicked by the outburst. Tiffany retreated slightly behind Beatrice, wiping away her fake tears, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought she was securing her place in high society by publicly humiliating the discarded wife. Within moments, the heavy double doors of the dining room swung open. The general manager of the Oak Ridge Country Club, a stern, imposing man named Mr. Sterling, marched into the room flanked by two burly security guards in dark suits. Beatrice crossed her arms, her chest heaving with righteous indignation. "It is about time, Sterling," Beatrice barked, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "These two women have sneaked into the dining room. The younger one is currently stalking my family. I want their guest passes shredded, and I want them escorted off the property by your security team immediately. If they resist, call the police." Mr. Sterling stopped walking. He did not look at Beatrice. He did not signal the security guards to approach our table. Instead, he adjusted his suit jacket, walked directly over to me, and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, unwavering respect. "Good morning, Madam Director." Mr. Sterling said, his voice carrying clearly across the dead-silent dining room. "I apologize for the disturbance. Is everything satisfactory with your table?" The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Beatrice lowered her hand slowly, her eyes wide with total incomprehension. Tiffany's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. "Sterling, what are you doing?" Beatrice demanded, her voice cracking. "I told you to throw them out. They are not members. They do not have the pedigree or the funds to be in this building." Mr. Sterling finally turned to look at Beatrice, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. "You are vastly mistaken, Mrs. Vance. This woman is not a guest, and she certainly does not need a membership." I placed my hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth and looked directly into Beatrice's horrified eyes. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute certainty in my tone made her physically recoil. 2 years ago, Beatrice, this prestigious club was millions of dollars in debt, I stated calmly, letting the facts hang in the air. The board of directors was facing immediate bankruptcy. The bank was preparing to foreclose and sell this historic property to a commercial developer to be bulldozed into a strip mall. You and your wealthy friends were about to lose your favorite playground. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed. She knew about the club's financial crisis. Everyone in their circle did. It had been a source of massive gossip until a mysterious private equity firm swooped in at the 11th hour and bought out the debt, saving the institution. I am the sole proprietor of that private equity firm. I continued, watching the blood drain completely from Beatrice's face. I am the anonymous primary benefactor who bailed this heavily indebted club out of bankruptcy. I do not just belong in this building, Beatrice. I own the debt. I own the equity. I effectively own the entire club. The wealthy wives at Beatrice's table gasped, shrinking back in their chairs. The social hierarchy of the room had just violently flipped, and Beatrice was plummeting to the very bottom. And as the majority stakeholder, I added my voice, turning icy. I have zero tolerance for patrons who violate our strict harassment code of conduct. Creating a public disturbance, screaming at other patrons, and attempting to weaponize the staff to bully a woman you view as beneath your social class is an absolute violation of your membership agreement. I looked up at the manager. "Mr. Sterling, please revoke Beatrice Vance's membership effective immediately, cancel her accounts, and ban her from the premises." Mr. Sterling nodded sharply. "Yes, Madam Director." Beatrice let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. "You cannot do this. You are a basic bookkeeper. You are lying. Jamal will sue you. Connor will destroy you." Her threats were utterly useless. Mr. Sterling signaled the two security guards. They stepped forward instantly, flanking Beatrice on both sides. "Ma'am, it is time to leave," one of the guards said firmly, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Do not make us carry you out." Beatrice fought them, screaming and thrashing as the guards gripped her arms. The entire dining room watched in stunned silence as the self-proclaimed queen of Oak Ridge society was forcibly dragged away from her table. She kicked her expensive heels, her diamond necklaces flashing under the chandeliers as they hauled her backward through the dining room and out the double doors. Yaiso. Tiffany was left completely exposed. She stood alone by the empty chairs, her face a mask of absolute terror. She had tied her entire future to Beatrice's coattails, and Beatrice had just been unceremoniously thrown into the parking lot. Tiffany grabbed her designer diaper bag and ran out of the room, sprinting after the security guards without looking back. My mother picked up her champagne flute and took a slow, elegant sip. "The crab cakes here really are exceptional," she murmured, offering me a brilliant smile. I nodded, returning the smile. The room slowly began to resume its normal volume, the wealthy patrons returning to their meals, terrified of drawing my attention. I had successfully dismantled the last pillar of their family's arrogance. But the morning was not over. Just as my mother and I were finishing our coffee, heavy, frantic footsteps echoed from the grand foyer. The dining room doors burst open, crashing loudly against the wall. Jamal sprinted into the lobby. His expensive weekend suit was completely rumpled. His tie was loosened and he was sweating profusely, his face red and slick with panic. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as his wild eyes scanned the room until they locked onto me. He completely ignored the stares of the wealthy club members. He charged toward my table, his hands gripping the back of an empty chair so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "What did you do?" Jamal screamed, his voice raw and ragged with desperation. "The sale collapsed. The buyer pulled out 10 minutes ago. The escrow company flagged a massive, unresolvable title dispute, and my bank is demanding immediate payment on my accounts. I need that cash today, Chloe. What did you do to the sale?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I looked at the man who had tried to steal my daughter, drain my savings, and leave me freezing in the snow. I looked at him and delivered the final devastating blow. Jamal stood trembling in the grand lobby of the country club, his face flushed with a desperate, manic heat. He gripped the back of an ornate dining chair, demanding to know what I had done to his precious house sale. His chest heaved as he babbled frantically about title disputes and frozen funds, completely oblivious to the elite patrons staring at his total public collapse. I simply smoothed the lapel of my tailored jacket, looked him dead in the eye, and told him to save his frantic questions for our scheduled mediation. I turned and walked out through the heavy oak doors alongside my mother, leaving him hyperventilating amidst the wreckage of Beatrice's ruined social standing. The weekend had been a systematic surgical dismantling of their unearned pride. Monday afternoon was strictly reserved for the absolute eradication of their future. The downtown mediation center was a sterile construct of frosted glass, polished chrome, and cold gray carpet designed specifically to force hostile parties into uncomfortable submission. I sat perfectly still beside my attorney, Eleanor Vance. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone in the quiet conference room. Across the wide mahogany table sat Jamal and Connor. The sleek, arrogant executive from Christmas Eve was entirely gone. Jamal looked physically ill. He was running on pure panic, his leg bouncing erratically under the table, his silk tie pulled loose from his collar. He needed the liquid cash from the house sale immediately to fund the lavish high society lifestyle he had arrogantly promised his mistress. He was completely oblivious to the fact that Tiffany was drowning in predatory debt. My earlier audit had revealed that her credit cards were maxed out. Her luxury car was pending repossession, and her supposed generational wealth was entirely fabricated. She had been using him as a blind financial life raft, pushing him to expedite the sale of our home through a shady equity firm she secretly controlled. Jamal was desperate to close the deal, entirely unaware he had almost sold our home to a front company designed to absorb his cash and cover his mistress's tracks. Connor, however, was desperately trying to maintain his facade of legal superiority, though the dark, heavy circles under his eyes betrayed the sheer terror of his impending firm eviction. He reached into his designer briefcase and aggressively slid a thin, insulting settlement document across the glass table toward Eleanor and me. The arrogance rolling off him was almost suffocating. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers and attempting to project absolute dominance. He stated that Jamal was willing to drop his emergency custody appeal and graciously give me a $10,000 buyout for the house. It was double his original insulting offer, presented as if he were bestowing a royal gift upon a grateful peasant. Connor sneered, stating that I needed to be realistic about my grim situation. He then made the fatal error of mocking my father. He claimed that relying on Calvin for shelter or legal strategy was a fool's errand. He loudly declared that a retired blue-collar clerk, who spent his entire life stamping municipal forms, could not possibly understand the complexities of property division, let alone afford to support a dependent daughter and a grandchild on a fixed government pension. The heavy glass door to the conference room swung open with a quiet, definitive click. Calvin stepped inside. He wore a simple, impeccably pressed dark suit, his demeanor completely calm and entirely unbothered by the toxic tension filling the room. He walked silently to our side of the table and took the empty chair directly beside me, resting a thick, heavy leather-bound folder on the polished wood. Connor rolled his eyes, visibly irritated by the interruption, and leaned forward, deciding to lecture all of us on the absolute certainty of real estate law. Connor aggressively stated that Jamal was the primary name on the mortgage. He insisted that because Jamal's name was the sole entity listed on the banking loan, he had the absolute unilateral right to force a sale and liquidate the property equity. He pounded his index finger against the table, declaring that no local judge in the state would ever block a rightful owner from liquidating his own property, especially when the discarded spouse had absolutely no provable income. Jamal let out a harsh, strained laugh, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He leaned across the table and told me to just take the settlement scraps before he decided to leave me with a mountain of legal fees instead. Calvin did not react to the laughter. He did not raise his voice. He simply unclasped the heavy leather-bound folder and opened it. He looked directly at Connor with eyes as hard and unforgiving as granite. Calvin quietly stated that Connor might want to request a full refund from his law school. In exactly 3 minutes, my father systematically and ruthlessly dismantled Connor's entire legal argument. Calvin revealed that while Jamal had indeed taken out a mortgage for the physical structure of the house, he had never actually owned the land beneath it. Calvin slid a crisp original document across the table. It was the master deed to the entire residential subdivision. Calvin's commercial real estate holding company owned the land. 5 years ago, Calvin had quietly leased the specific parcel to Jamal under a highly restricted conditional ground lease to help us build our starter home. But Calvin had built ironclad fail-safes into the contract. He pointed to a specific clause highlighted in bright yellow ink. Because Jamal had actively lied on his initial mortgage application, claiming full ownership of the parcel, to secure a lower interest rate, he had committed federal mortgage fraud. Under the strict terms of Calvin's ground lease, any fraudulent financial activity tied to the property immediately triggered a reversion clause. The physical house, the equity, and all associated residential rights instantly reverted back to Calvin's holding company. The house sale had collapsed because the escrow company discovered Jamal was trying to sell land he legally did not own. Jamal was not a homeowner cashing out. He was a fraudulent tenant who had just been evicted by his father-in-law. Connor turned a sickly, ghostly pale. The blood drained completely from his face as he stared at the master deed. He realized instantly that Jamal had lied to him, had withheld critical lease documents, and had manipulated his own firm into filing fraudulent motions with the court. Connor opened his mouth, stammering desperately, trying to formulate a sentence to formally withdraw as Jamal's legal counsel before he was dragged down into a massive fraud investigation. Before Connor could utter a single word to save himself, I placed my hand flat on the table. I looked at Jamal, whose chest was heaving with silent, terrified breaths, and then at Connor, who was already inching his chair backward toward the door. I slid my thick, heavily encrypted forensic audit dossier across the polished mahogany table directly to Jamal. The file was internally labeled E_4. I locked my eyes onto Jamal's panicked face and spoke with absolute chilling clarity. "You did not just drain our savings, Jamal. You embezzled $1.2 million from your corporate employer." Jamal froze, his eyes widening in pure horror. I tapped the cover of the dossier. There is a file you can reference named F_10. It contains the exact offshore routing architecture you used to wash the stolen corporate capital. Jamal began to shake violently, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. I turned my gaze to his lawyer, watching the absolute terror wash over him. "And Connor, you do not get to walk away from this." I pulled out a separate stack of verified financial ledgers. There is a file you can reference named G_10. It maps the dummy directors straight back to your downtown law firm. Connor's breath hitched, a wet, panicked sound echoing in the quiet room. I slid another document toward him, making sure he saw the municipal stamps. There is a file you can reference named H_10. It outlines the exact commercial code violations and the hidden morality clauses you breached, which is precisely why your firm is currently being evicted from my building. Finally, I dropped the last piece of undeniable proof right in front of Connor's shaking hands. There is a file you can reference named I_10. It contains the original Shell Company Incorporation papers. Your signature is on them, Connor. You are the registered agent for a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement pipeline. The silence in the mediation room was absolute. They had walked in demanding my complete surrender. Now they were staring at the irrefutable documentation of their own complete destruction. The slaughterhouse, as it turned out, was draped in imported silk and smelled of expensive champagne. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp, clear brilliance that seemed to perfectly reflect the cold, calculating precision of my plan. My mother, Vivian, and I stepped out of my hired town car and handed the keys to the valet at the Oak Ridge Country Club. Vivian wore a tailored cream pantsuit that radiated quiet power, her posture completely straight, her eyes taking in the sprawling, manicured estate with absolute confidence. For 5 years, I had walked through these heavy oak doors 2 steps behind Jamal, keeping my head down while Beatrice introduced me to her friends as her son's little charity case. She had ruthlessly weaponized this club against my family, using the strict dress codes, the exorbitant initiation fees, and the unspoken social rules to constantly remind Vivian and me that we lacked the pedigree to truly belong. Today I was not walking behind anyone. We bypassed the hostess stand, entirely strolling past the intricate ice sculptures and the sprawling champagne bar. The Sunday brunch was in full swing, the massive dining room packed with the city's most affluent families and influential power brokers. At the absolute center of the room, occupying the largest and most visible table beneath the grand crystal chandelier, sat Beatrice. She was entirely in her element, wearing an ostentatious emerald green dress and dripping in diamonds that caught the morning light. She was holding court with 6 other wealthy matriarchs, her loud, ringing laughter floating above the ambient noise of the room. Sitting directly to her right, wearing a sickeningly sweet smile and my favorite pearl earrings, was Tiffany. Beatrice was practically glowing as she presented Tiffany to her high society circle, loudly praising her supposed refined tastes and elevating her as the sophisticated upgrade their family had desperately needed. Vivian and I did not hide in the corners. We walked directly to the reserved table right next to Beatrice's, a prime spot overlooking the immaculate green grass of the 18th hole, and sat down. It took exactly 30 seconds for Beatrice to notice us. The loud, ringing laughter at her table died instantly. Beatrice paused mid-sentence, her champagne flute frozen in the air. Her eyes darted from me to my mother, her face flushing a deep, angry red. Tiffany let out a theatrical, trembling gasp, clutching her chest, as if we had walked in carrying loaded weapons. "What on earth do you think you are doing here?" Beatrice hissed, pushing her chair back violently and marching over to our table. Her voice was meant to be a harsh whisper, but her unbridled rage made it carry clearly across the quiet dining room. "You do not belong here, Chloe. And bringing your mother to gawk at my family is a new level of pathetic desperation." I unfolded my linen napkin with slow, deliberate precision and placed it on my lap. "We are here for brunch, Beatrice. The crab cakes are highly recommended." Tiffany immediately seized the opportunity to play the victim. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself, her eyes shining with perfectly manufactured crocodile tears. She looked around at the other wealthy patrons, making absolutely sure she had a captivated audience. "Please, Chloe. Tiffany pleaded, her voice trembling with fake terror. I know you are unstable right now, but stalking us to our private club is terrifying. We just want to move on peacefully. Please stop harassing our family. The surrounding tables fell completely silent. The wealthy patrons were watching us with morbid fascination, their forks suspended in the air. Beatrice stood taller, emboldened by Tiffany's performance and the undivided attention of her elite peers. You are deeply disturbed, Chloe, Beatrice announced loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear her declaration. Jamal was right to throw you out. I knew you were unhinged, but tracking us down at an exclusive members-only club is absolute lunacy. You are trespassing. Get up and leave this instant before I have you thrown out like the trash you are. Vivian calmly picked up her silver fork, examining it in the light. We are not leaving, Beatrice. We have every legal right to be sitting at this table. Beatrice let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed unpleasantly in the grand room. A legal right. Do you hear yourself, Vivian? You are a public school teacher married to a retired clerk. You could not afford the valet parking at this establishment, let alone a dining tab. I tolerated you in this building when your daughter was married to my son. But that charity has officially expired. Beatrice whipped her head around, snapping her fingers wildly at a passing waiter. Get the club manager immediately. Bring security. I want these trespassers removed from the premises right now. If they resist, call the police. The waiter scurried away, panicked by the sudden outburst. Tiffany retreated slightly behind Beatrice, wiping away her fake tears, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought she was securing her place in high society by publicly humiliating the discarded wife. Within moments, the heavy double doors of the dining room swung open. The general manager of the Oak Ridge Country Club, a stern, imposing man named Mr. Sterling, marched into the room, flanked by two burly security guards in dark suits. Beatrice crossed her arms, her chest heaving with righteous indignation as she awaited my eviction. It is about time, Sterling, Beatrice barked, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. These two women have sneaked into the dining room. The younger one is currently stalking my family. I want their guest passes shredded, and I want them escorted off the property by your security team immediately. Mr. Sterling stopped walking. He did not look at Beatrice. He did not signal the security guards to approach our table. Instead, he adjusted his suit jacket, walked directly over to me, and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, unwavering respect. Good morning, Madam Director. Mr. Sterling said, his voice carrying clearly across the dead silent dining room. I apologize for the disturbance. Is everything satisfactory with your table? The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Beatrice lowered her pointing hand slowly, her eyes wide with total incomprehension. Tiffany's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Sterling, what are you doing? Beatrice demanded, her voice cracking under the strain. I told you to throw them out. They are not members. They do not have the pedigree or the funds to be in this building. Mr. Sterling finally turned to look at Beatrice, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. You are vastly mistaken, Mrs. Vance. This woman is not a guest, and she certainly does not need a membership. I placed my hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth and looked directly into Beatrice's horrified eyes. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute certainty in my tone made her physically recoil. 2 years ago, Beatrice, this prestigious club was millions of dollars in debt, I stated calmly, letting the facts hang in the heavy air. The board of directors was facing immediate bankruptcy. The bank was preparing to foreclose and sell this historic property to a commercial developer to be bulldozed into a cheap strip mall. You and your wealthy friends were about to lose your favorite playground. Everyone in this room remembers the crisis. You remember the panic until a mysterious private equity firm swooped in at the 11th hour and bought out the debt, saving the institution. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed. She knew about the club's financial crisis. It had been a source of massive gossip. I reached into my designer handbag and extracted a stack of legally binding financial documents. I placed the first document on the table, smoothing it out. There is a file you can reference named K M_11. It contains the original debt purchase agreement signed by the club's board of directors, fully authorizing the buyout. I placed a second document down next to it. There is a file you can reference named L_11. It outlines the complete transfer of institutional equity to my private holding company, securing majority voting rights over the board. I am the anonymous primary benefactor who bailed this heavily indebted club out of bankruptcy. I continued watching the blood drain completely from Beatrice's face. I am the sole proprietor of that private equity firm. I do not just belong in this building, Beatrice. I own the debt. I own the equity. I effectively own the entire club. The wealthy wives at Beatrice's table gasped, shrinking back in their chairs as the social hierarchy of the room violently flipped. And as the majority stakeholder, I added, placing a third document onto the glass. I have zero tolerance for patrons who violate our strict harassment code of conduct. There is a file you can reference named M_11. It is the updated membership charter you signed last year. Creating a public disturbance, screaming at other patrons, and attempting to weaponize the staff to bully a woman you view as beneath your social class is an absolute violation of your agreement. I looked up at the manager. Mr. Sterling, please revoke Beatrice Vance's membership effective immediately. I slid the final document toward him. There is a file you can reference named N_11. It is the formal revocation authorization. Cancel her accounts and ban her from the premises permanently. Mr. Sterling nodded sharply. Yes, Madam Director. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. You cannot do this! You are a basic bookkeeper! You are lying! Jamal will sue you! Connor will destroy you! Her threats were utterly useless. Mr. Sterling signaled the two security guards. They stepped forward instantly, flanking Beatrice on both sides. Ma'am, it is time to leave, one of the guards said firmly, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. Do not make us carry you out in front of your friends. Beatrice fought them, screaming and thrashing as the guards gripped her arms. The entire dining room watched in stunned, breathless silence as the self-proclaimed queen of Oak Ridge society was forcibly dragged away from her table. She kicked her expensive heels, her diamond necklaces flashing under the chandeliers as they hauled her backward through the dining room and out the double oak doors. Tiffany was left completely exposed. She stood alone by the empty chairs, her face a mask of absolute terror. She had tied her entire future to Beatrice's coattails, and Beatrice had just been unceremoniously thrown into the parking lot. Tiffany grabbed her designer diaper bag and ran out of the room, sprinting after the security guards without looking back. My mother picked up her champagne flute and took a slow, elegant sip. The crab cakes here really are exceptional, she murmured, offering me a brilliant, knowing smile. I nodded, returning the smile. The room slowly began to resume its normal volume, the wealthy patrons returning to their meals, terrified of drawing my attention. I had successfully dismantled the last pillar of their family's arrogance. But the morning was not over. Just as my mother and I were finishing our coffee, heavy, frantic footsteps echoed from the grand foyer. The dining room doors burst open, crashing loudly against the wall. Jamal sprinted into the lobby. His expensive weekend suit was completely rumpled. His tie was loosened, and he was sweating profusely, his face red and slick with panic. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as his wild, desperate eyes scanned the room until they locked onto me. He completely ignored the stares of the wealthy club members. He charged toward my table, his hands gripping the back of an empty chair so hard his knuckles turned stark white. What did you do? Jamal screamed, his voice raw and ragged with desperation. The sale collapsed. The buyer pulled out 10 minutes ago. The escrow company flagged a massive, unresolvable title dispute, and my bank is demanding immediate payment on my accounts. I need that cash today, Chloe. What did you do to the sale? The ride back to my penthouse was completely silent. The sheer magnitude of the destruction we had just unleashed in that mediation room hung heavily in the air, a testament to the absolute power of irrefutable leverage. Jamal and Connor had walked into that frosted glass conference room, fully expecting to dictate the terms of my surrender. Instead, they had been handed a one-way ticket to federal indictment. Connor was a dead man walking in the legal world, and Jamal was staring down the barrel of a massive corporate embezzlement scandal. I felt no pity. Cornered rats will always turn on each other to survive, and I fully expected the infighting to begin before their elevator even reached the ground floor. I was not prepared, however, for how quickly the panic would spread to the rest of their toxic ecosystem. When the private elevator doors parted at the penthouse level, I stepped out to find Keisha frantically pacing the expanse of my marble lobby. Jamal's sister, normally a picture of haughty, unearned arrogance, looked entirely unhinged. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled, her perfect blowout was a mess of tangled strands, and she was aggressively biting her perfectly manicured thumbnails. She whipped around as the elevator chimed, her eyes wide with a manic feral desperation. Connor had clearly called her the second he escaped the mediation room. He knew his career, his firm, and his freedom were completely incinerated, and Keisha knew that her lavish, carefully curated life as a wealthy partner's wife was about to evaporate overnight. She did not offer a greeting. She simply threw herself toward me, her hands clasped together in a pathetic display of begging. "You have to stop this," Keisha sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "You have to pull the audit, Chloe. Connor is packing a bag. He is talking about fleeing the state. You cannot send the father of my children to federal prison over Jamal's stupid mistakes. Jamal tricked him. Jamal manipulated the paperwork. Connor is innocent." I walked past her, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I unlocked the heavy double doors to my residence and stepped inside, tossing my keys onto the silver entry console. Keisha scrambled in right behind me, completely ignoring the fact that she was uninvited. "Connor is a senior partner at a corporate law firm," I replied, not bothering to look at her as I walked toward my home office. "He is not a victim. He is the registered agent for a fraudulent shell company. He built the legal architecture to wash stolen corporate capital. He is a criminal, Keisha." She followed me into the office, her breathing ragged. She realized that playing the victim card was not going to work. The rats were turning, and Keisha was ready to abandon her own brother to save her husband's skin. She stepped in front of my desk, slamming her hands down flat on the glass surface. "If you spare Connor, I will give you Beatrice." Keisha said, her voice dropping to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. "I will give you the one thing that will utterly destroy my mother." I paused, my hand hovering over the power button of my dual monitor setup. Beatrice had been the architect of my misery for half a decade. She had orchestrated the country club humiliation, cheered on Jamal's infidelity, and continuously belittled my family. The opportunity to dismantle her completely was the ultimate prize. I sat down in my leather ergonomic chair, my eyes locking onto Keisha. "Start talking," I commanded. Keisha swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room, as if she expected her mother to materialize from the shadows. "Beatrice is entirely fake." Keisha spat out a lifetime of suppressed resentment bleeding into her words. "She does not have a dime to her name. Her entire luxurious lifestyle, the mansion, the cars, the jewelry, it is all funded by a strict generation-skipping trust fund established by our late grandfather." I leaned forward, my interest entirely captured. Beatrice had spent her entire life weaponizing her supposed generational wealth, using the promise of future inheritance to control Jamal and Keisha, dictating their careers, their spouses, and their choices. "She is just the trustee," Keisha continued, rapidly desperate to secure her deal. "She is only legally entitled to a small, fixed living stipend. The principal is strictly locked. It belongs entirely to Jamal, me, and eventually Zuri. But Beatrice has been threatening to manipulate the board of trustees for years. She told us that if we did not obey her every command, she would have the trust bylaws rewritten to disinherit us. That is why Jamal is so terrified of her. That is why he is so desperate for cash to fund Tiffany. Beatrice threatened to cut off his allowance if he embarrassed her. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. The entire Vance family dynamic was built on a foundation of financial terrorism. Beatrice held the keys to their grandfather's vault, and she used that power to keep her children on a very tight, very suffocating leash. Before Keisha could bargain any further, my personal cell phone began to vibrate aggressively on the desk. The caller ID flashed Beatrice's name. She was calling from a new number, likely because I had blocked her primary line after having her thrown out of the Oak Ridge Country Club. I held up a single finger, silencing Keisha, and answered the call, placing it on speakerphone so the audio would capture clearly in the room. "You vindictive, low-class sociopath!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice vibrating with an unholy, unhinged rage. Her country club humiliation had clearly pushed her past the point of sanity. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You humiliated me in front of my peers. You are trying to destroy my son. I will bury you." I did not respond. I simply launched my secure forensic software, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard as I began initiating a deep dive into the Vance family financial architecture. "I have an unlimited legal war chest," Beatrice threatened, her breathing heavy and erratic. "I am the sole trustee of the Vance estate. I have tens of millions of dollars at my absolute disposal. I will hire a dozen firms. I will drown you in endless crippling litigation until you are bankrupt and living on the street. I will drag your father through the mud, and I will ensure that the family courts grant Jamal full, unconditional custody of Zuri. You will never see your daughter again." She had crossed the final absolute boundary. Threatening my daughter was the fatal mistake that sealed her doom. I muted the microphone on my end of the call, letting her continue her deranged, threatening monologue as I bypassed the standard firewalls of the city's banking registry. I ran a comprehensive cross-reference audit on Beatrice's personal checking accounts against the master ledger of her grandfather's trust. The software chewed through the data, organizing the chaos into a clear, undeniable pattern of criminal activity. Keisha watched in stunned silence as the monitors lit up with rows of highlighted transactions. "There is a file you can reference named O_13. It contained the original unalterable testament of the grandfather's generation-skipping trust. It explicitly stated that the principal capital was absolutely untouchable. Beatrice was legally forbidden from accessing the core funds for any reason." I opened the next window, cross-referencing her recent banking activity. "There is a file you can reference named P_13. It mapped the strict disbursement rules set by the traditional banking institution, acting as the estate's primary trustee." Beatrice's threat about an unlimited legal war chest was a massive criminal bluff. She had no authority to use trust funds for personal litigation. But as my audit drilled deeper into the shadow ledgers, the true extent of her depravity became glaringly obvious. Beatrice was not just a manipulative mother. She was a prolific, unrepentant thief. "There is a file you can reference named Q_13. It displayed a horrifyingly clear paper trail of illegal capital siphoning. For the past 6 years, Beatrice had been systematically breaching the trust. She had forged beneficiary authorization forms using her position as trustee to illegally bleed the protected principal. I tracked the destination of the stolen capital. The sheer audacity of her spending was staggering. She had illegally transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars to prop up Tiffany's fabricated wealthy lifestyle, desperately trying to integrate Jamal's mistress into high society. She had dumped massive, unauthorized wire transfers into Connor's failing real estate investments to keep Keisha quiet and compliant. And most damning of all, she had been paying her exorbitant Oak Ridge Country Club initiation fees and monthly dues, using stolen money belonging to her own grandchildren. "There is a file you can reference named J_13. It provided the ultimate, undeniable proof. It contained the digitally verified wire transfer receipts, all bearing Beatrice's electronic signature, moving protected trust principal directly into her private, unsecured checking accounts. She had committed massive, systematic fiduciary fraud. I unmuted the phone. Beatrice was still ranting, her voice hoarse from screaming threats about destroying my life and taking my child. "Beatrice?" I interrupted, my voice as cold and sharp as a surgical scalpel. "I highly recommend you stop planning your imaginary litigation and start looking for a criminal defense attorney who specializes in federal fiduciary fraud." She stopped dead. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, deafening terror. "You do not have a legal war chest," I stated, my eyes locked onto the undeniable proof glowing on my monitors. "You have a severely depleted, illegally accessed trust fund. You have been siphoning the protected principal for 6 years. You funded Jamal's mistress, you bailed out Connor, and you bought your way into a country club using money that legally belongs to my daughter. I heard a sharp, panicked intake of breath. Beatrice tried to speak, but only a strangled, desperate sound emerged. I am not going to negotiate with a thief, I said, reaching for my mouse. I am going to end you. I terminated the call. Keisha was staring at me, her face completely ashen, her body trembling uncontrollably as she realized the absolute scope of the destruction I held in my hands. Connor's offer to testify against Jamal meant absolutely nothing now. They were all equally guilty, all inextricably tied to a massive web of embezzlement and fraud. I did not hesitate. I drafted an immediate, heavily encrypted legal notification. I bypassed local authorities and addressed the communication directly to the Compliance Division of Vanguard Heritage Trust, the traditional banking institution acting as the estate's primary institutional overseer. I attached the complete, irrefutable forensic dossier outlining every single unauthorized withdrawal, forged signature, and illegal transfer. I hit send, legally submitting a file indexed as K_4 directly to the bank's fraud department. Within minutes, the institutional response was swift and merciless. An automated alert pinged on my screen, a copy of the emergency notice sent to all relevant parties. Vanguard Heritage Trust had received the evidence. They immediately triggered a total administrative lock. They froze every single one of Beatrice's personal and trust-affiliated accounts. Her credit cards would be declined. Her assets were seized. She was entirely cut off from the capital she had stolen to fund her arrogance. The bank mandated a mandatory emergency audit meeting for all beneficiaries by Friday. Beatrice Vance, the supposed queen of high society, was about to face a federal banking tribunal. The aroma of roasted espresso beans and warm pastries filled the air of the downtown coffee shop, providing a stark contrast to the absolute financial carnage I had just orchestrated. Tuesday morning felt remarkably peaceful. The administrative lock Vanguard Heritage Trust had placed on Beatrice's accounts was absolute, and the ripple effects of that frozen capital were already tearing through the Vance family's carefully fabricated reality. I sat at a small corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping a black coffee and watching the city move entirely unbothered by the storm raging just a few blocks away. That peace was violently shattered when the heavy glass door of the cafe was yanked open. Tiffany marched inside, her breathing erratic, her eyes darting wildly around the room until they locked onto me. The polished, smug mistress who had mocked me at the Oak Ridge Country Club was completely gone. In her place stood a frantic, disheveled woman running on pure, unadulterated panic. She was wearing yesterday's designer clothes, but they looked rumpled, and her expensive blowout was a tangled mess. She stomped across the hardwood floor, her heels clicking aggressively, and slammed both of her hands flat onto my table, rattling my coffee cup against its saucer. "You need to fix this right now," Tiffany demanded, her voice a harsh, strained hiss that drew the immediate attention of the barista and several nearby patrons. "You need to call your lawyers and undo whatever malicious legal trap you set." Jamal's black card just declined at the hotel. It declined at the boutique. His accounts are completely locked, and the bank teller told him it was tied to a hostile asset freeze. "You are cutting off my money. Chloe and I will not stand for it." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I slowly picked up my coffee cup, took a measured sip, and looked at her with the cold clinical detachment of a forensic auditor observing a parasite. "You are mistaken, Tiffany. I have not locked Jamal's personal accounts." "Do not lie to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she leaned closer, her knuckles turning white against the table. "Jamal promised me Paris. He promised me the equity from the house sale to launch my new lifestyle brand. He bought me a Cartier watch our very first month together to prove the kind of life he could provide. He told me I was stepping into generational wealth, that I deserved a life of absolute luxury because I am an upgrade from a boring, basic wife like you. You are just bitter and jealous, and you are trying to starve us out. Lift the freeze, Chloe, or I swear I will destroy you." Her outburst was a masterpiece of accidental honesty. She had just publicly confessed that her entire attraction to Jamal was transactional. She did not love him. She loved the illusion of wealth he projected, the stolen money he spent on her, and the lavish lifestyle he had fraudulently promised. She was a grifter who thought she had landed a whale, completely unaware that she had hitched herself to a sinking cinder block. When I simply continued to stare at her in absolute silence, Tiffany's frustration boiled over into sheer malice. She reached into her designer handbag and aggressively pulled out her latest model smartphone, shoving the screen directly into my face. "You think you hold all the cards because of some financial tricks?" Tiffany sneered, a desperate, nasty smile twisting her features. "Look at this." The video playing on the screen showed a chaotic moment at a park from months ago. It was a heavily, maliciously edited clip. In reality, Zuri had been running toward a busy street, and I had lunged forward, grabbing her arm tightly to pull her back from oncoming traffic. But the footage Tiffany had manipulated stripped away the street, the cars, and the context. It was zoomed in and slowed down, making my panicked intervention look like an aggressive, unprovoked physical assault on my own child. The audio had been altered to amplify Zuri's surprised cry, completely removing my shouts of warning about the cars. "I have a dozen bloggers waiting for me to hit send." Tiffany threatened, tapping the screen with a manicured nail. "I will post this everywhere. I will send it to every local news outlet and every mom group in the city. I will completely destroy your reputation. Child Protective Services will be at your door before midnight. You will be branded an abusive monster, and Jamal will automatically get full custody of that kid. You are going to unfreeze those accounts, wire $500,000 into my personal checking account by noon, and walk away from this divorce with nothing. If you refuse, your life as a mother is over." She stood tall, her chest heaving, waiting for me to crumble to beg to surrender to her extortion. Instead, I calmly reached into my leather briefcase resting on the chair beside me. I pulled out a thin, unmarked manila envelope and placed it squarely in the center of the table. I did not look at the phone. I looked directly into the terrified, empty eyes of a woman who had severely overestimated her own intelligence. "I strongly suggest you sit down and read what is inside that envelope before you make the worst mistake of your miserable life," I stated, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. Tiffany hesitated, the smug confidence faltering as she stared at the envelope. Slowly, she pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down, her eyes darting suspiciously between me and the package. She reached out and flipped the clasp open. I watched her pull out the first document. There is a file you can reference named Z_14. It was a comprehensive, deeply invasive background check detailing her long, pathetic history of grifting. It outlined her 2 previous evictions, her 3 defaulted car loans, and the exact paper trail of her maxed-out delinquent credit cards. "You are not a wealthy socialite, Tiffany," I said, watching her eyes widen in shock as she read her own miserable financial history. "You are a fraud drowning in debt." She quickly shoved the paper aside and pulled out the next page, her hands beginning to tremble. "There is a file you can reference named X_14. It contained the corporate registration documents for Sunrise Equity Holdings, the dummy corporation she had desperately set up using predatory high-interest personal loans to try and buy my house at a severe discount. It proved she was actively trying to scam Jamal out of his own liquid assets. Your entire plan was to steal the house equity to bail yourself out of bankruptcy." I continued, my words striking like physical blows. "You thought Jamal was your golden ticket. You thought he was a titan of industry." Tiffany swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. She reached into the envelope again, her bravado completely eradicated, and pulled out a stack of bank records. "There is a file you can reference named Q_14. It contained Jamal's current unredacted banking statements, completely exposed through the federal audit I had triggered. Read the bottom line, Tiffany." Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers until they hit the final balance. The color drained from her face instantly, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. The balance was completely negative. "Jamal is overdrawn by $300,000, I stated with absolute merciless precision. "He does not have generational wealth." Beatrice cut him off. "He does not have a house to sell because my father repossessed the land. The black card declined today because there is literally nothing left. Jamal is entirely broke. Tiffany let out a ragged, trembling breath, dropping the papers onto the table as if they had burned her. "You are lying," she whispered, though the sheer panic in her eyes confirmed she knew every single document was authentic. "He is a senior executive. He has a massive corporate portfolio." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, delivering the final, fatal reality check. I pulled out the last document from the envelope and slid it directly under her chin. "There is a file you can reference named W_14. It was the preliminary summary of the forensic audit I had submitted to the federal authorities detailing the exact offshore routing architecture Jamal had used to steal corporate funds." "He is not an executive anymore," I whispered, ensuring every word landed with devastating impact. "He is an embezzler. He stole $1.2 million to fund the lifestyle he promised you. Those Cartier watches, the luxury hotel suites, the expensive dinners, they were all paid for with stolen money. And because you knowingly accepted those gifts and attempted to use a shell company to launder his assets through a real estate transaction, you are now legally implicated as an accessory to federal wire fraud." Tiffany shrank back into her chair, her entire body shaking violently. The phone she had used to threaten me just moments ago slipped from her fingers and clattered uselessly onto the table. "I did not freeze his accounts, Tiffany. The federal government froze his accounts. The SEC and the FBI are currently dismantling his entire life. He is going to federal prison, and if you stay attached to him, you are going right into the cell next to his. You blackmailed me with a fake video, but I am destroying you with the absolute truth." I stood up, adjusting my coat with calm, deliberate movements. I looked down at her shattered, trembling form. "You have absolutely no leverage here. You are tied to a sinking ship, and the water is already up to your neck. Have a wonderful day." I turned and walked away, navigating through the quiet tables toward the exit. I did not rush. I moved with the steady, unbothered grace of a woman who had just executed a flawless victory. As I pushed the heavy glass door open to step out into the bright city street, I paused and glanced back through the window. Tiffany was not looking at me. She was not crying over Jamal. She had shoved all the incriminating documents back into the envelope. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she reached deep into her designer bag, completely ignoring her primary phone on the table. She pulled out a cheap plastic burner phone. She practically smashed the keypad with her frantic fingers, raising the device to her ear with wild, desperate eyes. She was not calling Jamal to warn him. She was dialing the SEC whistleblower hotline, desperately scrambling to sell out her lover in a frantic bid to secure federal immunity and a cash bounty before the authorities kicked her door down. The rats were not just turning on each other anymore. They were eating each other alive. I stepped out of the coffee shop and into the crisp, biting wind of the city street. The morning sun reflected sharply off the glass skyscrapers towering above me. Behind the heavy doors of the cafe, Tiffany was frantically dialing the federal whistleblower hotline, desperately trying to trade her lover for her own freedom. Her panic was a tangible electric current, but I left it behind me. I signaled my waiting town car, sliding into the quiet, soundproof luxury of the back seat. I opened my encrypted laptop, ready to finalize the destruction of the Vance family, when my personal cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The caller ID flashed a name I had not expected to see today. It was Marcus Thorne, the chief executive officer of Apex Global, the massive international logistics firm where Jamal was employed. Marcus was a titan of industry, a man who commanded boardrooms and dictated global market trends. He was notoriously inaccessible, shielded by layers of executive assistants and corporate legal counsel. But today he was calling my direct line. I pressed the answer button and held the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent. "Chloe, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Marcus said. His normally booming, authoritative voice was tight-clipped and running on an undercurrent of sheer panic. "I bypassed human resources and our internal legal department to make this call. I am speaking to you strictly off the record, not as Jamal's wife, but in your capacity as an independent, certified forensic auditor." "I am listening, Marcus," I replied, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. "Our corporate accounting department triggered a massive internal alarm this morning," Marcus explained, his breathing heavy. We are currently staring at a catastrophic hole in our third quarter capital projections. The missing funds are staggering, and the timeline of the discrepancies perfectly matches the exact month you and Jamal filed for your separation. I leaned back into the leather seat of the town car. Jamal had always been a master of corporate illusion. He had spent his entire career at Apex Global, weaponizing his casual weekend golfing relationship with Marcus. Jamal would strut through the financial department, aggressively intimidating junior staff members and steamrolling standard auditing protocols by loudly claiming he had the absolute undivided ear of the CEO. He used Marcus as a human shield, demanding unearned massive discretionary bonuses and expediting shady expense reports by pretending Marcus had personally pre-approved them. Marcus, isolated in his executive suite, had been completely oblivious to the fact that his name was being used to terrorize the accounting floor. He manipulated your protocols, Marcus, I stated calmly. He used your authority to bypass the dual authentication security measures. He did worse than that, Marcus fired back, his anger finally breaking through his professional restraint. Jamal was sitting in my office less than an hour ago. He brought a young 23-year-old entry-level accountant with him. The kid is named Liam. He is fresh out of college, drowning in student debt and working 80-hour weeks just to keep his head above water. Jamal sat across from my desk, looked me dead in the eye, and handed me a fabricated, completely doctored ledger. Jamal aggressively claimed that Liam had been secretly skimming millions from our offshore accounts. My grip on the phone tightened. Jamal was not just a thief. He was a sociopath. He was perfectly willing to send an innocent, terrified kid to federal prison just to buy Tiffany another Cartier watch and cover his own tracks. Liam was having a full panic attack in my lobby. Marcus continued, his voice shaking with a cold, unforgiving fury. The kid was hyperventilating, crying, swearing on his life that he had never touched those accounts. Jamal just stood there demanding I call the authorities and have the boy arrested immediately. My conscience could not take it, Chloe. The kid's terror was too real. Jamal's outrage was too polished. I stalled. I sent them both home pending an investigation. I know you specialize in financial forensics. I know you have been auditing Jamal's personal accounts for your divorce. Tell me the truth. Did he do this? He did not just do it, Marcus. He orchestrated the entire pipeline. I replied, my voice slicing through the digital connection with absolute lethal certainty. Open your secure corporate terminal. I am sending you an encrypted direct data packet right now. I want you to look at the screen while I am on the line. I heard the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard on his end, followed by the soft chime of an incoming secure file. I see the master folder, Marcus said, his breath hitching slightly. Open it, I commanded. There is a file you can reference named P_15. It contains the exact digital footprint, the specific IP addresses, and the geographic locations of the user who initiated the unauthorized transfers. You will see that the system logs do not point to Liam's cubicle. They point directly to the private IP address of Jamal's penthouse router. He authorized the wires from his own living room while Liam was not even in the building. I heard a sharp, heavy exhale from Marcus as he opened the document. Move to the next ledger, I instructed, my eyes tracking the data on my own screen. There is a file you can reference named U_15. It completely maps the offshore routing numbers. Jamal did not just blindly steal the capital. He used your corporate infrastructure to funnel the money through 3 different international tax havens before dumping it into a domestic holding account. I have tracked every single cent. The routing numbers match the corporate outflow down to the exact decimal. The silence on the line was deafening. Marcus was a seasoned executive, but staring at the undeniable mathematical proof of a massive internal betrayal was enough to render anyone speechless. There is a file you can reference named Y_15. I continued smoothly, driving the final nails into Jamal's corporate coffin. It contains the original incorporation papers for the shell company that received the stolen funds. The company is called Sunrise Equity Holdings. The registered agent is Connor Jamal's personal attorney. Jamal is listed as the sole hidden beneficiary. Liam has absolutely no connection to this entity. Jamal built a shadow corporation solely to wash your money. Marcus let out a low, dangerous growl. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was finally sinking in. Jamal had not just stolen from Apex Global. He had humiliated the CEO, abused the junior staff, and attempted to use the executive board as an unwitting accessory to frame an innocent employee. Open the final document, Marcus. There is a file you can reference named T_15. It is the final timeline. It maps the exact dates of Jamal's unearned corporate bonuses and the stolen offshore funds directly to his personal spending. You will see the matching receipts for luxury vehicles, high-end real estate retainers, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in jewelry. He bled your company dry to fund a secret, lavish lifestyle for his mistress. He was never a corporate asset. He was a parasite. The heavy, suffocating silence stretched over the phone line for nearly a full minute. I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic through the glass of my town car. When Marcus finally spoke, the panic in his voice was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a cold, calculated, and absolute ruthlessness. "I am not handing this over to our internal human resources department," Marcus stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "A quiet termination is a luxury reserved for human beings. Jamal is a monster. I am not just firing him, Chloe. I have already contacted the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI." I smiled, closing my laptop with a satisfying snap. "Jamal thinks he has outsmarted everyone." Marcus continued, his tone dripping with lethal anticipation. "He thinks he successfully framed Liam. He thinks he is untouchable. He has been loudly boasting around the office all week about the massive high society New Year's Eve gala he is hosting this Friday at the Grand Astoria Hotel. He rented out the entire Crystal Ballroom to celebrate his supposed promotion and his new life." Marcus paused, the sheer weight of his impending vengeance settling into his words. "I am going to let him put on his tuxedo. I am going to let him stand on that stage in front of his wealthy friends, his family, and his mistress. I am going to let him pour the vintage champagne. And right before the clock strikes midnight, the FBI and I are going to walk through the main doors of that ballroom. We are going to arrest him in front of the entire city." The rented luxury villa overlooking the city skyline was a monument to desperate, fraudulent excess. Every inch of the sprawling estate screamed of Jamal and Beatrice's frantic need to maintain their illusion of absolute power. Ice sculptures shaped like swans flanked the entrance, a 10-tier champagne tower dominated the grand foyer, and a live string quartet played classical arrangements from a suspended balcony. They had transformed the rented property into a fortress of high society gluttony, terrified that if they stopped spending for even a single second, the whispers of their impending financial ruin would become a deafening roar. Beatrice was circulating through the crowd in a custom beaded gown, clutching a crystal flute of vintage champagne, smiling so hard her face looked painfully stretched. She knew Vanguard Heritage Trust had frozen her entire existence. She knew the emergency audit was looming in a matter of hours. Yet, she was playing the part of the untouchable matriarch, desperately hoping that projecting enough arrogance would somehow magically rewrite reality. Jamal was doing the exact same thing. He was holding court near the grand sweeping mahogany staircase, wearing a bespoke velvet tuxedo paid for with the stolen capital from Apex Global. Just 3 weeks prior, Jamal had stood in the foyer of our starter home, casually adjusting his designer cufflinks in the mirror, and explicitly barred me from attending this exact annual gala. He had looked me up and down, his eyes filled with a cold, absolute disdain, and told me I was entirely too uncultured to stand by his side. He claimed that my presence, my lack of elite pedigree, and my simple domestic mindset would be a profound embarrassment to him in front of Marcus and the corporate board. He had told me to stay home and fold laundry while he mingled with the titans of industry. He had firmly believed I was nothing but a heavy anchor dragging down his spectacular meteoric rise to the top. Now that rising star was about to be violently ripped from the sky. As midnight approached, the ambient noise of the party began to shift. Jamal detached himself from a group of wealthy investors and moved gracefully up the first few steps of the grand mahogany staircase. He raised his crystal flute, tapping it sharply with a silver spoon. The sharp ringing sound cut through the classical music and the low hum of conversation. The string quartet immediately ceased playing. The elite crowd of hundreds turned their attention toward the staircase, expecting a standard grandiose corporate toast to ring in the new year. Tiffany materialized from the crowd, gliding up the stairs to stand directly beside him. She was wearing a blindingly expensive diamond necklace and a silver gown that clung to her frame. To the untrained eye, she looked like the perfect high society trophy. But I knew exactly what she had done in that coffee shop. I could see the frantic, terrified pulse beating rapidly in her neck. Her smile was incredibly rigid, her eyes darting nervously toward the main entrance every few seconds. She had spent the entire afternoon cooperating with federal investigators securing her own immunity, and now she was forced to stand beside the man she had just completely sold out, playing the role of the devoted, adoring partner. "Thank you all for joining us on this magnificent evening." Jamal began, his voice booming, with unearned absolute confidence. His chest puffed out as he smiled down at the sea of wealthy patrons. "This year has been a period of profound transition and spectacular growth for me, both professionally at Apex Global and personally. We are leaving behind the dead weight of the past. We are stepping into a future defined by limitless potential, elite partnerships, and absolute success." He turned to Tiffany, taking her trembling hand in his. The crowd murmured in anticipation. Beatrice stood at the front of the crowd, beaming with a desperate, manic intensity, thrilled that her son was finally publicly claiming a woman she viewed as a social equal. "A man is only as successful as the woman standing beside him," Jamal declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "For too long I was held back. But tonight I am stepping into my true destiny. I am thrilled to officially announce my engagement to Tiffany. I finally have a worthy, high-caliber partner by my side. A woman who understands ambition. A woman who truly belongs in this world." The crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause. Beatrice raised her glass high, letting out a sharp cheer of victory. Jamal smiled triumphantly, pulling Tiffany close for a perfectly choreographed kiss. That was the exact moment I gave the signal. The massive, heavy mahogany double doors at the entrance of the villa did not just open. They were shoved apart with a violent, booming force that echoed like a gunshot over the polite applause. The winter wind swept into the grand foyer, instantly chilling the room. The applause died instantly. The crowd turned as one massive entity, their eyes locking onto the entrance. I stepped over the threshold, completely shattering the illusion of Jamal's perfect night. I was not wearing the sensible domestic clothes he so deeply despised. I was wearing a breathtaking floor-length midnight blue designer gown that radiated absolute, undeniable power. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression carved from pure ice. Flanking my right side was my father Calvin, wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored dark suit, his granite-hard eyes scanning the room like a predator evaluating a herd of prey. On my left was my attorney, Eleanor Vance, holding a sleek black leather portfolio, her presence immediately recognized by several senior partners in the crowd who audibly gasped. We did not wait for an invitation. We walked forward. The sea of wealthy elite patrons physically parted for us. They stepped back, their champagne glasses lowered, creating a wide, completely clear path directly to the grand staircase. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. You could hear the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the marble floor. Jamal froze completely. His triumphant smile vanished his face, instantly draining of all color as he stared down at me. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost materialize to drag him straight to hell. Beside him, Tiffany let out a sharp, panicked squeak, her hand dropping from his arm, as if he had suddenly caught fire. Beatrice, standing near the bottom of the stairs, looked physically ill, her entire body trembling as she recognized the absolute ruin walking toward her son. "What are you doing here?" Jamal hissed, his voice barely a terrified whisper, completely devoid of the booming arrogance from seconds prior. "You are not on the list. Security." I ignored his pathetic command. I did not stop walking until I reached the base of the stairs. Calvin and Eleanor stopped right behind me, forming an impenetrable wall of support. I ascended the first 3 steps, placing myself on the exact same physical level as Jamal and his newly minted traitorous fiancée. I looked him dead in the eye. The sheer terror radiating off his body was almost intoxicating. "I am not here to enjoy the champagne, Jamal," I said, my voice carrying with absolute crystal clarity across the dead silent ballroom. "I am here to finalize the dead weight of the past." I reached out my hand. Eleanor seamlessly placed a thick, heavy document into my palm. The paper was crisp, bearing the raised, embossed seal of the State Family Court. I stepped forward and pressed the document flat against Jamal's chest. He reflexively brought his hands up to grab it, his fingers shaking violently. "That is your finalized judge-signed divorce decree," I announced, projecting my voice so every single one of his wealthy colleagues and investors could hear the absolute destruction of his personal life. "You do not get a single dime of my assets. You do not get access to my holding company, and you do not get to use my daughter as a pawn. I have been granted sole permanent custody of Zuri. Your parental rights have been severely legally restricted. You are entirely stripped of your leverage." The whispers broke out immediately, sweeping through the crowd like a shockwave. Beatrice let out a low, horrified moan, gripping the banister to keep from collapsing. Jamal stared at the decree, his eyes darting frantically over the judge's signature, his mouth opening and closing as he desperately tried to formulate a response to save his public image. "Chloe, you cannot do this here," Jamal stammered, his voice cracking, the sweat beading on his forehead. "You are making a scene. We can talk about this privately, please." I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an executioner. "We are completely done talking, Jamal. You wanted to step into your true destiny tonight. You wanted to leave your past behind. I am simply helping you clear the stage." I took a slow, deliberate step back, moving entirely out of the center of the staircase. I smoothed the fabric of my gown, locking my eyes onto his terrified face as I delivered the final fatal revelation. "Because I did not come here tonight just to serve you papers," I whispered, ensuring only he and Tiffany could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "I came to watch the main event." Before Jamal could process my words, the heavy mahogany doors at the entrance crashed open for a second time. The crowd gasped, turning back toward the foyer. Striding through the entrance, his face a mask of absolute unforgiving fury, was Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Apex Global. And fanning out behind him, moving with rapid tactical precision, were 6 federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical vests, clearly emblazoned with the letters FBI. The final domino was about to fall. The heavy mahogany doors remained pinned against the walls, allowing the biting winter wind to sweep into the grand foyer and instantly erase the manufactured warmth of the rented villa. The transition from high society celebration to an active federal crime scene was absolute and instantaneous. The string quartet, previously playing a delicate soaring waltz from the suspended balcony, halted with a discordant screeching scrape of a bow against cello strings. 6 federal agents streamed through the main entrance, their dark tactical windbreakers forming a jarring, violent contrast against the sea of imported silk, bespoke velvet, and glittering diamonds. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency, fanning out across the marble floor to secure every exit and secure the perimeter. The sheer presence of the FBI instantly suffocated the ambient noise of the gala. The polite, restrained applause that had greeted Jamal's engagement announcement morphed into a collective, breathless gasp of horror. Jamal stood frozen on the second step of the grand staircase, his arms still rigidly extended from his aborted toast. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His chest stopped moving. He did not merely look scared, he looked entirely hollowed out. For Jamal, this was not just a legal crisis. It was the materialization of his ultimate, deeply ingrained psychological nightmare. His entire existence, his very sense of self-worth, relied absolutely on public validation. He had spent his adult life carefully constructing an impenetrable illusion of superiority, treating junior staff members like dirt, bullying his way into exclusive circles, and wearing custom-tailored tuxedos to project an aura of untouchable generational wealth. He had barred me from this very gala weeks prior because he claimed my simple presence would be a profound embarrassment in front of his elite colleagues. Now the absolute titans of industry, the wealthy investors he had spent years aggressively courting, and the socialites he desperately wanted to impress, were watching him get cornered like a common street thief. The wealthy patrons closest to the staircase physically recoiled, stepping backward in unison, as if Jamal had suddenly contracted a highly contagious lethal disease. They pulled their designer gowns and tailored jackets away, creating a wide, isolating circle around the base of the stairs. Jamal was completely alone, trapped under the unforgiving glare of the crystal chandeliers, forced to endure the absolute destruction of his carefully curated facade in front of the exact audience whose approval he craved more than oxygen. Across the room, standing near the towering champagne fountain, Connor finally recognized the sheer, unmitigated gravity of the raid. As a senior corporate attorney, his legal mind instantly processed the presence of federal agents, accompanied by Marcus Thorne. He knew the FBI did not breach a high-profile New Year's Eve gala without ironclad sealed federal indictments already signed by a judge. He knew the dummy corporation, the offshore accounts, and the forged documents had all been traced. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized him. Connor dropped his crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered sharply against the polished marble floor, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. He did not look at Jamal. He did not look at me. He spun on his heel and bolted frantically toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, desperately hoping to slip out through the service exit before the agents locked down the rear of the estate. Keisha, who had been standing directly beside him, reached out in a state of confused terror, her fingers grazing his tuxedo jacket. Connor did not even hesitate. Operating on pure, selfish survival instinct, he threw his arm back and physically shoved his wife out of his path. Keisha cried out as the violent push sent her crashing hard onto the marble floor, her designer dress tangling around her legs as she skidded into the base of the champagne tower. Connor's cowardly flight lasted exactly 3 seconds. 2 federal agents stationed near the hallway recognized the sudden erratic movement. They intercepted him with brutal, unforgiving speed. One agent drove a shoulder directly into Connor's chest, killing his momentum instantly, while the second agent swept his legs. Connor hit the floor with a heavy, breathless thud. The agents pinned him face down against the cold marble, firmly wrenching his arms behind his back. The sharp mechanical clicking of heavy zip ties securing his wrists echoed through the grand foyer. The senior corporate partner, the man who had arrogantly promised to ruin my father in a mediation room just hours prior, was now reduced to a whimpering detained suspect pressed against a dirty service floor. I stood perfectly still at the base of the staircase, exuding an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. I did not flinch when the glass shattered. I did not look away when Connor was tackled to the ground. Calvin stood firmly at my right shoulder, his protective presence an unyielding fortress, while Eleanor Vance stood to my left, her legal portfolio held tightly against her chest. Marcus Thorne, his face carved from pure rage, strode directly toward me, flanked by a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a windbreaker, identifying him as Lead Agent Miller. Marcus stopped just inches away, his chest heaving as he looked from me to the trembling figure of Jamal on the stairs. "We secured the perimeter." Madam Director Marcus stated, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that carried absolute authority. "The local authorities are currently securing his office downtown, and his corporate accounts have been entirely seized. We are ready for the final transfer." I gave Marcus a single sharp nod of acknowledgement. I reached into the hidden pocket of my midnight blue gown and extracted a small, sleek titanium flash drive. It felt heavy in my palm, a tiny piece of metal containing the complete, undeniable ruin of the men who had tried to destroy me. I turned my attention to Lead Agent Miller. I did not whisper. I spoke with a clear, ringing projection, ensuring that every single high society guest, every investor, and every member of the Vance family heard my exact words. "Agent Miller," I said, holding the drive out between us. "As an independent certified forensic auditor, I am formally submitting this unredacted digital dossier into federal custody. It contains the complete verified cross-reference audit of Sunrise Equity Holdings. Inside, you will find the exact digital footprint, the offshore routing numbers, the forged incorporation documents, and the specific IP addresses, tying every single stolen cent from Apex Global directly to Jamal Vance and his registered agent Connor. The money trail is absolute. Agent Miller stepped forward and took the drive from my hand, sealing it immediately inside a clear tamper-evident evidence bag. "Thank you for your full cooperation with the Bureau, ma'am," he replied sharply. "We have everything we need to proceed with the arrests." On the stairs above me, Tiffany began to hyperventilate. She had spent the entire afternoon dialing the SEC whistleblower hotline, desperately trying to secure her own immunity, but the reality of the federal raid was finally breaking her mind. She pressed her back against the mahogany banister, her hands shaking violently as she clutched the massive, newly minted diamond engagement ring on her left hand. She had demanded that ring as a trophy, a symbol of her victory over the discarded wife. A female federal agent detached herself from the perimeter and walked methodically up the first few steps, stopping directly in front of Tiffany. Tiffany Vance, the agent, stated, her tone strictly procedural and entirely devoid of empathy. "You are currently in possession of assets purchased directly with stolen corporate funds. Under federal asset forfeiture laws regarding wire fraud and embezzlement, that jewelry is now classified as seized state evidence. Hand it over immediately." Tiffany let out a shrill, piercing scream of denial. She ripped the ring off her finger, holding it tightly against her chest, as if she could physically protect her fabricated wealth from the federal government. Jamal did not even look at her. He was staring blankly at the FBI agents advancing toward him with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, his entire world collapsing into a singular point of inescapable doom. The agent did not ask a second time. She stepped forward, gripped Tiffany's wrist with authoritative force, and smoothly pried the diamond ring from her trembling fingers. The agent dropped the glittering stone into a plastic evidence bag, reducing Tiffany's entire high society ambition to a seized asset tag. Tiffany collapsed against the banister, sobbing hysterically as her lavish future evaporated into thin air. But the true explosion did not come from the stairs. It came from the shadows of the grand foyer. Beatrice Vance had watched her entire legacy disintegrate in the span of 3 minutes. She had watched her country club status vanish her generation, skipping trust fund, freeze her son face a federal indictment, and her son-in-law get tackled to the floor. The iron grip she had maintained over her family and her social circle was entirely permanently shattered. Something deep inside Beatrice's mind snapped. The polished, arrogant matriarch vanished entirely, replaced by a feral, unhinged animal. Beatrice let out a guttural, blood-curdling shriek that tore through the quiet ballroom. She shoved her way blindly through the stunned crowd of wealthy patrons, her eyes wide, manic, and completely devoid of sanity. She locked her deranged gaze directly onto me, lowered her head, and charged wildly down the length of the grand foyer, her manicured hands raised like claws, hurtling straight toward my face. The crisp morning air felt invigorating as I stepped out of the coffee shop, leaving the shattered, terrified Mistress behind me. I signaled my waiting town car and slid into the quiet, soundproof luxury of the back seat. The city blurred past the tinted windows, serving as a rapid backdrop to the absolute financial carnage I was currently orchestrating. I opened my encrypted laptop, ready to finalize the remaining asset seizure protocols, when my personal cell phone vibrated sharply against the leather armrest. The caller ID flashed a name I had entirely not expected to see today. It was Marcus Thorne, the chief executive officer of Apex Global, the massive international logistics firm where Jamal was employed. Marcus was a titan of industry, a man who commanded boardrooms and dictated global market trends with a single signature. He was notoriously inaccessible, shielded by thick layers of executive assistants and corporate legal counsel. But today, he was bypassing his entire corporate hierarchy to call my direct line. I pressed the answer button and held the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent. "Chloe, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Marcus said. His normally booming, authoritative voice was tight-clipped and running on a heavy undercurrent of sheer panic. "I bypassed human resources and our internal legal department to make this call. I am speaking to you strictly off the record, not as Jamal's wife, but in your professional capacity as an independent certified forensic auditor. I am listening, Marcus, I replied, my fingers hovering over my keyboard ready to intercept whatever data he was about to provide. Our corporate accounting department triggered a massive, highly classified internal alarm this morning. Marcus explained, his breathing heavy and erratic. We are currently staring at a catastrophic hole in our third quarter capital projections. The missing funds are staggering, and the timeline of the digital discrepancies perfectly matches the exact month you and Jamal officially filed for your separation. I leaned back into the leather seat, a cold realization washing over me. Jamal had always been a master of corporate illusion. He had spent his entire career at Apex Global, weaponizing his casual weekend golfing relationship with Marcus. Jamal would strut through the financial department, aggressively intimidating junior staff members and steamrolling standard auditing protocols by loudly claiming he had the absolute undivided ear of the CEO. He weaponized his proximity to Marcus, heavily implying that any junior auditor who dared to question his expense reports or verify his client acquisition funds would find themselves immediately blacklisted from the industry. He used Marcus as a human shield, demanding unearned massive discretionary bonuses and expediting shady expense reports by pretending Marcus had personally pre-approved them. Marcus, isolated in his executive suite, had been completely oblivious to the fact that his name was being used to terrorize the accounting floor. He manipulated your internal protocols, Marcus, I stated calmly, diagnosing the breach instantly. He used the illusion of your authority to bypass the dual authentication security measures. He did worse than that. Marcus fired back, his anger finally breaking through his polished professional restraint. Jamal was sitting in my office less than an hour ago. He brought a young 23-year-old entry-level accountant with him. The kid is named Liam. He is fresh out of college, drowning in student debt, and working 80-hour weeks just to prove his loyalty to this firm. Jamal walked him into my suite like a lamb to the slaughter. Jamal slammed a 200-page doctored ledger onto my mahogany desk and began shouting. He aggressively pointed his finger at Liam, accusing the boy of secretly siphoning millions into encrypted offshore accounts over the past 9 months. Jamal demanded I call the federal authorities and have the boy arrested right there in my office. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. Jamal was not just a thief. He was a ruthless sociopath. He was perfectly willing to send an innocent, terrified kid to federal prison just to buy Tiffany another Cartier watch and cover his own filthy tracks. Liam could not even speak. Marcus continued, the disgust in his voice palpable. The kid went completely pale. He dropped to his knees in my lobby, hyperventilating, crying and swearing on his mother's life that he had never touched a single unauthorized account. He was terrified. He thought his life was entirely over. And Jamal just stood there, adjusting his designer tie, watching this boy have a total psychological breakdown with absolutely zero empathy. My conscience could not take it, Chloe. The kid's terror was too real. Jamal's outrage was too polished. I stalled. I sent them both home pending a formal investigation. I know you specialize in financial forensics. I know you have been auditing Jamal's personal accounts for your divorce. Tell me the absolute truth. Did he do this? He did not just do it, Marcus. He orchestrated the entire pipeline. I replied, my voice slicing through the digital connection with absolute lethal certainty. Open your secure corporate terminal. I am sending you an encrypted direct data packet right now. I want you to look at the screen while I am on the line. I heard the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard on his end, followed by the soft chime of an incoming secure file breaking through his firewall. I see the master folder, Marcus said, his breath hitching slightly as the data loaded onto his monitor. Open it, I commanded. There is a file you can reference named R_16. It contains the exact digital footprint, the specific MAC addresses of the hardware used, and the geographic IP locations of the user who initiated every single one of the unauthorized transfers. You will see that the system access logs do not point to Liam's assigned corporate cubicle. They do not even point to the Apex Global building. They point directly undeniably to the private IP address of Jamal's luxury penthouse router. He logged into the corporate mainframe via a virtual private network and authorized the fraudulent wires from his own velvet sofa while Liam was not even clocked into the building. I heard a sharp, heavy exhale from Marcus as he opened the document, the undeniable proof staring him right in the face. Move to the next ledger. I instructed, my eyes tracking the data on my own screen. There is a file you can reference named B_16. It completely maps the offshore routing numbers and the complex layering architecture Jamal utilized. He did not just blindly steal the capital. He used your own corporate logistics infrastructure to funnel the money through 3 different international tax havens before dumping the consolidated funds into a domestic shell company. I have tracked every single cent through the digital blockchain. The routing numbers match the corporate outflow from Apex Global down to the exact undeniable decimal. The silence on the line was deafening. Marcus was a seasoned executive, a man who dealt in billions, but staring at the undeniable mathematical proof of a massive internal betrayal by someone he considered a friend was enough to render him completely speechless. There is a file you can reference named H_16. I continued smoothly driving the final lethal nails into Jamal's corporate coffin. It contains the original unredacted incorporation papers for the domestic shell company that received the laundered funds. The company is registered under the name Sunrise Equity Holdings. The registered agent is Connor Jamal's personal, fiercely loyal attorney. And Jamal is explicitly listed in the hidden bylaws as the sole ultimate beneficiary. Liam has absolutely zero connection to this entity. Liam does not even have a passport. Jamal built a shadow corporation solely to wash your stolen money, and he used his own lawyer to build the legal framework. Marcus let out a low, dangerous growl. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was finally sinking in. Jamal had not just stolen from Apex Global, he had humiliated the CEO, abused the junior staff, and attempted to use the executive board as an unwitting accessory to frame an innocent, hardworking employee. Open the final document, Marcus. There is a file you can reference named S_16. It is the comprehensive final timeline. It overlays the exact dates of Jamal's unearned corporate bonuses and the stolen offshore fund deposits directly onto his personal banking ledger. You will see the matching time-stamped receipts for luxury sports cars, high-end real estate retainers, private chartered flights, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in Cartier jewelry. He bled your company dry to fund a secret lavish lifestyle for his mistress Tiffany. He literally financed his infidelity with your third-quarter capital. The heavy, suffocating silence stretched over the phone line for nearly a full minute. I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic through the thick glass of my town car. When Marcus finally spoke, the panic in his voice was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a cold, calculated, and absolute ruthlessness. I am not handing this over to our internal human resources department. Marcus stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised absolute destruction. A quiet termination is a luxury reserved for human beings. Jamal is a monster. I am not just firing him, Chloe. I have already contacted the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI. I smiled, leaning forward in my seat. Jamal thinks he has outsmarted everyone. Marcus continued, his tone dripping with lethal anticipation. He thinks he successfully framed Liam. He thinks he is untouchable. He has been loudly boasting around the office all week about the massive high society New Year's Eve gala he is hosting this Friday at a rented luxury villa. He rented out the entire estate to celebrate his supposed promotion and his new life. Marcus paused, the sheer weight of his impending vengeance settling heavily into his words. I am going to let him put on his custom tuxedo. I am going to let him stand on that grand staircase in front of his wealthy friends, his family, and his mistress. I am going to let him pour the vintage champagne. And right before the clock strikes midnight, the FBI and I are going to walk through the main doors of that villa. We are coordinating right now. We are going to arrest him in front of the entire city. The ultimate lesson from Chloe's journey is that true power never needs to shout. Jamal and Tiffany built their entire existence on a fragile foundation of stolen wealth, toxic arrogance, and deception, believing they could easily crush anyone who stood in their way. However, Chloe proved that real strength lies in quiet preparation, unwavering composure, and absolute integrity. When toxic people severely underestimate your intelligence and attempt to strip you of your dignity, you do not need to fight them in the mud. Instead, secure your independence, gather your undeniable evidence, and let their own boundless greed orchestrate their inevitable downfall. Have you ever had to silently outsmart someone who severely underestimated your strength? Tell us your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more satisfying tales of ultimate justice.